All right. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Adrienne Mackey. I am the founder and artistic director of Swim Pony Performing Arts, which is a company that fuses live performance and game design. I'm also an assistant professor of acting, directing, and devising at University of Washington School of Drama, and actually in the midst of teaching a class called Game Design for Live Performance, which is a little bit of what I'm going to pull from today. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and do a little screen share here. So, like I said, I run a company called Swim Pony. We are a company committed to joyful live performances that invite audiences into critical examination of the surrounding world. And the company's genre-defying works are created with an ensemble of multidisciplinary artists who fuse site-based theater, immersive staging, and interactive game design. So just to give you a sense of some of the ways that's played out in projects in the past, the company's founding work was a piece called Survive. As a former chemistry major, I was really interested in seeing if experiential performance interactive work could give audiences a visceral sense of the scale of the cosmos. So we invited people into this giant choose your own adventure play experience, whatever you want to call it, that allowed people to wander down different hallways of a 20,000 square foot warehouse in search of different experiences in there. This was a piece called It's So Learning, which was a collaboration with Philly alt comedy company, The Berserker Residents. This was a show that was trying to use experiential performance and game to explore the brutality of the American public education system. In the show, we did things like give people standardized tests that they didn't prepare for, made them sing songs that they didn't know the lyrics to, all in an effort to try to get them to foment a rebellion against the play itself. In 2017, I did a project called The End, which was a transmedial performance played with analog card decks online and also over text message. This was a piece that was aimed at trying to get audiences to spend a month contemplating their own mortality and the way that that helped them learn something about the lives that they were living. Players got mailed a package of stuff before the game started. And at the beginning of the month of play, got a text message from this character called The End, who was kind of a cheeky manifestation of mortality, inviting them to draw a first card. Players quickly learn that each of the cards in the deck that they've been given represent a different challenge that once picked sends them to an online platform where they get to read a little bit of background and then undertake like a 15 to 20-minute quest sometime in their day. Challenges included all kinds of different formats. In one case, like that card in the upper right-hand corner you see, was an invitation to think about the last meal you ever want to eat in your life. The one in the upper left-hand corner was actually making a list of the important objects and who you want to give them to. Some of these were more participatory, so we had guided phone meditations, and ones like this one where you actually went to a downtown office building and role-played an end-of-life diagnosis to practice what that might feel like in real life. After each challenge, players would text back and forth with this character I mentioned called The End, who was actually played by a team of actors on a call system. We had this awesome kind of clubhouse where we would all hang out. And the goal of the game was really to try to get players to think of themselves as the main characters, defining a win state for what they thought they wanted out of their own lives, and actually just creating kind of a reflective mirror of the things that they valued. One of my more recent projects is a thing called Trail Off. This is an app that if you're in the Philadelphia area, I encourage you to download. It includes 10 original BIPOC authored stories written for nature trails in and around the Philadelphia region. If you download the app, you can like select a story either by location or content, check it out. And once you actually go to the physical trail, the GPS in your phone unlocks the story in relationship to the actual things that you're seeing. Some of the trails are a little bit more straightforward. Some of them actually have like interactive opportunities where you can pick different routes to go down, which will actually change the story. And all of them are kind of synced to your unique pace and rhythm. Um, there's the App Store preview if you want to check it out. So that's some of the kinds of ways that I've thought about creating interactive narratives in kind of theatrical transmedial game-like formats. Oh, and if you happen to be in Seattle, we're releasing our first Seattle Trail Off story in June. So today, I thought it might be fun to share some of the tactics that I use for creating interactive stories. And this actually comes out of the class that I teach here at University of Washington, thinking about how to blend theater and game design into these kind of hybrid experiences. And one of the first questions I ask my students is what they think interactive stories are and how they're different than static ones. And one of the examples that I use is I say like, well, imagine that I handed you this like cardboard box, right? Initially, you might not find this object very interesting, but if I said to you, this is a game, instinctually, I think we can start to notice a different relationship that we have, that this thing that used to be kind of like a boring static object to observe suddenly becomes something that we want to like play with, interact with, and figure out what it can do. And I think this idea of turning static spaces into spaces of interaction rather than static observation is how I begin every single project that I do. Obviously, if you're here at the Playable Theater Symposium, you know that static stories are different than interaction. And it might be obvious to say, right, that interactive stories are powered by interaction. But I think we're so used to kind of like the linear ABC narrative that even me, after doing this for decades now, like I just always come back to this sense of like, what am I offering the player to do in this world is the story that I'm giving them. There's a beautiful phrase by a LARP designer who I love, who talks about this idea that interactive writers don't create things that are beautiful to watch, read, or listen to, but instead are beautiful to do. So I'm going to start with a big philosophical question. I'd just love you to like imagine an important choice that is imminent in your life right now. And if you stop and sort of think of this choice in this moment where you haven't yet made it, and just start to picture like viscerally the context that's informing your decision. So how much do you know about the potential outcomes? What are the risks and rewards that you can see? What past experiences have you had that are informing where you are at this moment and what might happen in the future? And who or what else is around you that's influencing one choice you might make over another? And this is how I start to think about creating a landscape of narrative. So again, instead of using the word context, we might think about the word landscape and really trying to think visually and geographically about those decisions rather than just as a philosophical idea. So at the moment anyone is making a decision, you are in this landscape of influence whose features are pushing you towards one choice or another one. And it's this kind of bird's eye looking at the landscape of choice that to me begins how I start to think about designing narrative. And again, I keep reinforcing this, but I think this idea of advancing exploration is really the key difference for me as we start to think about getting out of that traditional linear progression. So if we're starting to think about building narrative worlds versus scripting linear plots, we can say like one of the tools that we can start to think about is particularly think about spatial thinking. So some of the ways that I've tried to tackle this is things like drawing maps, constructing relationship webs, creating images that encourage investigation between events and characters as a kind of archaeological uncovering rather than a logical series that always follows each other. So I talked about this piece Survive at the beginning. This was a show that was entirely built around the audience's capacity to explore the physical space. And so one of the first things we did when we built this show was begin by drawing the ground plan and trying to think about like, well, where are the physical spaces that people are going to be able to go in this show? And how is that going to impact the way that they understand the story? And so what we started to do as a group was build a space that was related to each character. This map is a little maybe tricky to read initially, but as you go from the top to the bottom, you're actually progressing through the timeline of the show. So audiences would come into this central space that we called the hub, get a series of scenes, which you can see there is part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, and then break out into the various hallways until they found a character, experienced a small breakout scene, each of whose content could be substituted for each other. So they were equivalent experiences that would be non-overlapping. So if you saw one thing, you were by necessity not going to see another. Come back to that hub space, break out again. And we had this sort of pattern of like coming back for a regrouping, going out into an exploration, and then coming back again. I see some stuff in the chat, just checking to see. Cool. So what we ended up doing for the audience, in part because we wanted to give them a little clue into what the madness was that they were expected to do, is we created this map with a symbol for each of the characters. So at the beginning, characters would be standing in the central space with the gobo of this symbol placed over them. So if you were an observant audience member, you would notice that each character had a symbol. You would have been given this map. And you can see in the center there, there's a little light bulb. And so what we did in this hub space that people were sitting in is we lit up the door that was connected to that light bulb. And we told them, look at your map and see where the light bulb is. And so once we did that initial orientation, people could slowly start to figure out where characters would be located, and that each of those little dots you see below them corresponded to the scene breakout. So each of the 4 times they had a chance to leave the space, if they were paying attention, they could figure out which character they wanted to follow. And that meant that after they left, if they saw a character going down one space, they would be able to know where they were headed, or if they wanted to see somebody that they hadn't seen before, they could head in the opposite direction. So that's one way, making maps, that I think about creating interactive narratives. Another thing that I use a lot is this idea of assembly and collage. For many years, I lived in Philadelphia, and I got invited to this funny workshop by a guy named Frank Vagnoni, who wrote this book that you can see here called An Anarchist Guide to Historic House Museums. And one of the things that the workshop aimed to do was to get folks who run these historic house museums to notice the fact that their spaces were not very interactive, and therefore often like quite distancing to the people that visited them. Like, other than sort of looking at the stuff in them, there wasn't much to do. And this guy, Frank, was really interested in creating a more experiential, tactile kind of storytelling. And so he took us through a bunch of different exercises, which are written up in this book, which I highly recommend, to get people to think about how they might explore these spaces in new ways. So one of the things he talked about was like literally just drawing the path that people take through the building as a way of measuring their interest in different parts of it. He also did these like crazy graphs where he would follow people and like write down what they did or things that they said and plot them over time scales in terms of like energy, excitement, or imagination. And it really was interesting to me to think about like, what if this was the narrative script for the way that I began my interactive plot? But my absolute favorite exercise that he did was an opportunity to walk around the space, pick up the physical objects, like touch them, examine them. And then he gave us these little tags where we could like write our thoughts about what we were looking at and leave them on the object. And there were a bunch of us doing this all simultaneously. So you could not only like leave your thing, but pick up somebody else's thing and see what they thought about it. And the thing that I loved about this, again, going back to this idea of interaction versus observation, is because I had, by necessity of the activity, to bring my own opinions and ideas to the objects, the exact same material that I would have, sorry, did my screen freeze there for a second? Okay, I think I'm back. The exact same material that I might have like honestly found pretty boring if I had just been like instructed to look at it, was much more exciting because I suddenly got to have a part in assembling like how the content put together, what I got to look at, and actually leave behind some remnant of my experience with it. Um, and the thing that this reminded me of was hint to anybody who ever might want me to look at their kids. When I was a teenager, I used to babysit a bunch, and there's that moment when you're left alone, like the kids are asleep, you're waiting for the parents to come back, and obviously, like you snoop through people's stuff, right? Um, and the thing that I thought was so interesting about that experience is I felt like I was telling a story, or I was learning something about these people by observing the physical space that they had left behind. There was something so captivating and compelling about like deciding something about who these people were by looking in their fridge and going like, wow, like they only have white wine and pickles, or noticing that somebody's junk drawer is like extremely neat and tidy. And so this was another way that I started to think about how like putting things together through my own like active narrative collage, in many ways was like the most exciting version of the storytelling that I could do. So again, thinking about the way that stories can be told, not necessarily by just revealing events, but actually by the way that I find things that are already existing, that these pieces are already there, but the way that I put them together becomes as much of the narrative. And I think particularly in this like contemporary world of like internet and social media, it's just worth noting like we do this instinctually all the time in digital space, right? Like the last time that you learned the story of a person solely based on details that they told you directly or you witnessed is like almost nil. Um, so, an example, like if you Google me, right, like within a matter of minutes, you can like figure out where I work. You can look at the things that I'm interested in as a researcher. You can find something about like the places I went to school. You might learn that I was a chemistry major. You can find out something about my age, right? You can see projects that I've worked on and then link to my company profile, right? If you end up on my Instagram, you might like see that I wrote this book. And find out that I don't have that many Instagram followers, right? Like the information goes on and on. Like I just had a birthday, blah, 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 blah. And so already, and I was on America's Got Talent. That's at my Facebook. Anyway, so what I'm saying is, like we have this wealth of information that we start to construct around a person before they say a word to us. I'm just checking the chat to see what folks are saying in there. Great. I've got one more Instagram follower. um, so, uh, so, so I think like thinking about this kind of narrative storytelling as like a web of association, is again like another way that we can start thinking about interaction as the engine, versus kind of like plot. So these are some common examples that like we've seen in contemporary media, right? Like if we look at like a police web board of a mafia ring, like this is one way of telling a story. If we look at a family tree, right, online, this is another way that we can think about constructing a narrative that a player might want to uncover. Um, Even something as simple as like a Google Calendar can tell us a lot narratively about what's going on with a person. And if we incentivize somebody to dig into what's available for us, with some interesting clues, we can start to learn like really interesting things about that person. Obviously, something like an internet search history, right, like is a wealth of narrative data to mine. Okay, let me see what time I'm at. All right, good. So So these are some questions that I use when I start to think about like trying to construct these narrative collages, maps, webs, etc. Um, what can your audience see from where they are, and how much of that world is visible? What are the features of your story's terrain that are interactable, and what paths are available to them? How is that information revealed through the interaction? And what are the narrative elements linked to create meaning? And so these are kind of the four big questions that I go to when I'm first beginning to construct a story, especially those first moments that are like the inroads into a player getting the beginning of a narrative before they are incentivized to start constructing it. So I'm going to pause for a second before we jump into an exercise to actually try it and just see if there are any questions from anybody before we jump in. Don't see anything in the chat. Okay, if there are any, feel free to pop them as we go. So I thought it might be fun. Oh, I see one just came in. Okay, great. Thumbs up. So I thought it might be fun to actually like run through the beginning steps of a very basic interactive narrative, like game performance, whatever you want to call it. So I would encourage you to use whatever space you are physically in to undertake this exploration. I'm going to use my actual physical house, but if you are in an office space, that totally works. Like whatever space that you have access to where you can like literally look around and see what's there. So we're going to start just by recalling that anecdote that I told about like snooping around in people's house as a babysitter. And you are going to get to play House Sitter the game. um, so we're going to create an outline for an interactive game for a single audience member that takes place inside your home or whatever alternate space you want to use at this moment. If you're not in a space that you can explore, maybe you pick one that you know well, something that like you can kind of recall visually pretty quickly. But I recommend using a space that you actually can physically explore right now, if possible. So we'll kind of see how time goes, but at the end, if we have a chance, maybe people can write a little bit about like the actual specifics of what they make. So if you're feeling nervous, don't worry, we're going to walk through all the steps together. Okay, so House Sitter the game. So to start off with, I want you to identify a central mystery. So this is going to be the tension that pulls a player through the game's narrative, the thing that you think they're going to be excited to learn more about as they go through. So your mystery doesn't have to include crime or murder. It could include like a relationship-based story, like To a Lost Mentor, or it could be sort of like somebody thinking about a new life path, whatever you think might feel kind of like interesting and emotionally compelling. And if you don't want to make this story about yourself, like feel free to create an alternate main character. Just imagine somebody that might occupy this physical space in a meaningful way. So the thing that matters most is that your mystery is something that is revealed through players' actions in the space. So again, going back to that idea of like, what is beautiful to do? What are things that a person might be able to physically interact with that will teach them or help them uncover something more about this mystery? So once they've assembled all the facts together, there's going to be a new story that wasn't obvious from the start. So I'm going to give you actual 3 minutes to think about this mystery. You can just like contemplate it in your head, or if you want to write down some notes, that's totally cool. I'll keep a timer and I'll let you know when you're halfway done and when you've got 30 seconds left. So go ahead and start brainstorming your mystery. So you're about halfway through your time. And I see a few people have, at least one person has popped their mystery into the chat. So if you want to share with each other as we go along, feel free. You've got like 20 seconds left, and then we're going to go to the next step. All righty. So hopefully you've got your central mystery for the game. Next, what I want you to do is actually physically walk through your space. So rather than just like thinking about the things that are in there, I want you to just go and do a little exploratory walkthrough. It could be just one room. It could be your whole apartment or house if you're able to. You'll have to keep time for yourself if you can't hear the sound of my voice anymore. But I want you to think about that same thing that I mentioned with the cardboard box and calling it a game. Like you're looking through your space kind of with this idea of like, if I looked at this space as a game, what are the things that most instinctually make me want to interact with it, right? So what are the clickable objects that catch your eye as things that might be playable? And what are the details that begin to get exciting or important narratively? You can start to think of this as like an opportunity for a narrative scene to emerge. And again, like just kind of reinforcing what can people do here and what opportunities can you give them to interact with your landscape. I said 5 minutes, but I'm going to give you 4. But before we do that, I'm just going to give you a couple pictures of my actual home that I snapped while I was playing this game. So this is my mail stand. I looked at this and I went like, "Ooh, passport. That's kind of intriguing." And there was a card with a personal note written inside. This was on my kitchen counter, and I noticed like an appointment card with a date and time, and then also a cryptic to-do list. This is what's on my fridge, which has a lot of personal like information. And then over in the corner of my living room above a chair, there's a wedding photo and like a close up of like a bunch of names. This is clearly like the document that my husband and I, if you were a stranger, like would see it and sort of go like, oh, that's their wedding document. And then in a back room, there was this box that I found that's labeled memories, but it's got like some cryptic words behind it. And then this leads up to my attic, which is clearly the final boss level of my house sitter game. So these are just some examples to kind of like get your juices flowing. So walking through your house, thinking about it as a narrative landscape. Obviously, if you like were building this game over a longer period, you could like get a little bit deeper. So this is just going to be kind of like a base level exploration. I think the big thing that I find in this kind of process is not like controlling too much the way you might with a linear story when you go out. But you're actually like trying to find these emergent narrative elements that could be like an exciting gift to your process. So be open to things that maybe you hadn't first imagined. Let's go ahead and actually, before I do that, I'm going to give you 4 minutes to walk through your space. So we are at 29 on whatever time zone you're on. Come back at 33 with a list. And if you get back early, you can pop some of those things in the chat. So go ahead and take 4 minutes starting now. So if you can still hear my voice, we're 2 minutes in, so you're about halfway through. So you've got 30 seconds or so to snag your last couple of clickable objects there. And if you're already back, you can throw some of your juicy discoveries into the chat. There's some good ones in here. Very cryptic bottles of paint. Yeah, these are great. Okay, so you can continue to throw your lists into the chat if you want to share with other folks to inspire. The next thing we're going to do is take just 2 minutes to sit down some descriptive language about the aesthetic style of the landscape you want to evoke. So obviously part of this is going to be in conversation with the space as it already exists. So, you don't like, if your space is an office, like a very sort of like banal office building, you may not want to go like extreme science fiction if that's not like already kind of like intrinsic to the space. But you can imagine how you might like change it a little bit in ways that might like push it one way or another, right? So if your house is like a regular house, you could imagine, well, what if I did like sort of put like a bunch of like piles of stuff everywhere to sort of like insinuate that there's somebody who is like keeping all of these things. Because obviously that kind of space is going to be really different than one that's like extremely Spartan and tidy versus another one where like, you're furniture is all velvet or covered in dust. Um, Obviously, it's just worth saying, right? Like if this was a theatrical space that was like a theater space and you were building it from scratch or in a digital world, this part of the process would be a lot more intensive. But since you are coming in with a starting source material, I think it's helpful to actually work with the features that already are there, right? So go ahead, take 2 minutes. Again, I'll give you a 30-second warning to let you know when the time is up, but just starting to write down like some descriptive language about what the aesthetic style of this space is. Yeah, and if like if you're finding stuff before I get there, totally cool. Like you do not have to like follow the steps in the order um, if they come up naturally. I'm just peeking at all these objects. Birthday invitation is good. Ooh, smell. Yeah, I love the smell part. Yeah, the 70s time capsule is great. Failed minimalism is really good too. Okay, 30 more seconds just to throw some descriptive words in there. Cool. Okay. So again, if you're still writing, you can like keep playing around with that. I'll just give you the next prompt. So I'm going to give you 3 more minutes to ponder the different modes of interaction, right? So some folks are already starting to like find this and like write about this a little bit, so you can expand on things you've already got, or if you haven't yet, you can feel free to like take a peek around your space again and like literally just thinking about like what can people do and what are the forms that doing is going to take, right? So sometimes that's going to be like an explicit call to action, and sometimes it's going to be maybe a subtle invitation. So these are some examples I thought of, like a post-it note that's left for the player that could either just be informational or tell them to do something. Things like mail or photos or writings. A lot of people kind of mentioned these things in the list already. Text message, phone call, voice recordings that are left behind, emails, digital documents sent during play. If you want to go old school, you could have an answering machine. You could have objects that inherently tell a story. Or you could even have like actual acting interaction, right? So maybe there's a nosy neighbor that drops by. So thinking about like the space that you've created, the objects in it that are clickable, and this aesthetic that you've built, take 3 minutes to like list out some potential modes of interaction. And if you want to like start to like build out like some of the specific ways that's going to manifest. 3 minutes. So we've got one more minute. If you find that you're already done, you can like hone in on one of your modes and maybe start to like get some more details. I guess totally natural that this becomes a VR game, right? We're starting analog, but it would be really fun to like take that and translate it into a digital space. Yeah, a lot of folks are starting to put like really great sensory details in there. So that's another thing to like really think about. What are the visceral responses that folks are getting as they're doing these things? Okay, cool. So you can wrap on this one. And again, with any of these, like if you are still working, like I'll give you the next prompt, but you can continue to play with what's there. Um, with all of this, I said 4 minutes here. I'm actually going to make it three just because I want to leave a little time at the end. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes. And what I want you to do is start sketching out a map of your story's quote unquote scenes. So you have a sense of what the space is. You have a sense of like some of the things that people are going to interact with. You have the modes of interaction that might happen in. So now you're just going to begin to create a narrative map of how all of this begins to fit together. Um, I define a scene as any moment of interaction between a player and your narrative landscape. So some of those are going to have an obvious, like, quote unquote, solution, right? That might lead them to a next piece of information. Some of them may just be opportunities to add to the overall story. So your version of the map can be a physical drawing. It could be like a series of notes in an ideal progression, or it could be kind of more of a flowchart type thing. It's really whatever makes sense for you. So again, like just to show you, this was that example that I showed of that piece survive. So this was one way of structuring that. Along with kind of like a physical map. These were two of those things that I mentioned from that workshop. So whatever works for you in terms of how you think about like structuring a player's journey through the experience. If you are like really cooking with gas and you like have put all that in, you can also like put a little star on scenes that are absolutely necessary to the story or ones that are maybe optional. Um, so again, these are just those questions that I mentioned before. What can your audience see? What are the features of the terrain? How is that information revealed? Where did the narrative elements linked to create meaning? So go ahead, instead of four, I'm going to give you three. So go ahead and just begin to structure that map. Go for it. Yeah, and I can see from these like chat boxes, right? You're already starting to create scenes just by listing all of the interactive modes. Yeah. Ooh, under the bed. That's good. That's a great reveal. So that's about halfway through your 3 minutes. Obviously, if we had an architectural drawing of your space, that would probably be a helpful thing where you could start to pin things on there. If you are visually art facile, you can do that for yourself. Mm. You guys are great at this. Not surprising. 30 more seconds. I don't know unpacking. I have to look this up, Celia. All right. So again, if you're still kind of like working on your map, no worries. You can continue to play around with this. Um, you don't have to like strict order it. Um, uh, what I want to do, probably for our last little piece here, because I'd like to leave a little bit of time at the end to just chat, is to take 3 more minutes and actually just start to sketch out the details of your first actual scene that the player might experience. So this is the very first encounter that they're going to have with your house sitter game. Um, so this is probably intuitive, but I think it's worth stating that our entry scene sets a lot of the tone for what's to come. And that's both in terms of style of the game, right? So to get an kind of an aesthetic sense of the narrative, but also the mode of interaction, right? So if you have a dominant mode that you're interested in, it probably is going to be useful to help seed that here. So you want to give a sense of a little bit of both the style and mode of interaction that's possible. So I'll give you an example that I came with, again, just as a little inspiration. This was my game of house sitter. As I mentioned, the objects that I had before were influences. I decided to make my central mystery the reveal that the owner of the home is going through a divorce, and that she feels responsible for that divorce, and that she's currently on a vacation originally planned for her and her ex-husband. So these were some of the scenes that I mapped out for my player to interact with, that there was a single passport that was the husband's, not hers, on the mail stand, that there was a cryptic to-do list that had to do with some things going on with kind of the legal stuff of the divorce, boxes that were partially packed with 2 different destinations, some for her future place and some for his, that wedding photo that I showed you taken off the wall, an appointment card for a meeting with a lawyer, and then parts of the house where somebody's stuff has obviously recently been removed. I also, as I mentioned, like really wanted people to go in my creepy attic. And I thought that could be like an interesting final scene where the player would find a box of wedding memorabilia that's been opened, and clearly the main character has recently been looking through this. So this was the initial note, kind of like knowing that those were scenes I wanted the player to encounter, that was probably the ending place that I was headed. This was the initial note that I wanted the player to find on the door when they walked to my home. So it says, "Hey, thanks so much for watching the house. I know it was so last minute, but I realized one of us had to enjoy Paris. Haha. Anyway, make yourself at home. It's a mess with the boxes, but move stuff if you need to. The cable guy is coming at noon and might need the attic. Love, Sarah." So just to point out, like in this opening quote unquote scene, here's a couple things that I tried to underscore for the player, right? I mentioned the last minute thing, which just gives like a little contextual timeline info. I underlined the thing about one of us enjoying Paris to kind of seed this idea that the travel plan was originally for more than one person. I mentioned the Paris thing because I thought I might be able to like drop some hints there. I wrote the haha, so we kind of get a sense that Sarah is somebody who doesn't take herself too seriously. I mentioned the boxes because I thought that would be a useful kind of like telling of the player to go do that, that they should be allowed to move stuff, and that I also sort of like named this like 12 o'clock as like an important time, potentially to like open up that attic space if it hadn't already been opened. So go ahead and take your last 3 minutes before we open it up to some questions to create your first game here, or your first scene for the game here. If you finish with that early, you can also start to maybe imagine that last scene that you want to create. So you've got a kind of beginning and end. So go ahead and take 3 minutes. So that's about halfway through your few minutes of your outlining of that first scene. Oh, I love feeding the fish for the funeral. These are such good objects. 30 more seconds. I know it's super quick. These are so good. The neighbor is terrible. All right. So I know you probably could spend like 8 times as long on all of this. Because of time, and I do want to leave a little second. Folks are already popping stuff in the chat. If we had the space, we would have done 3-minute chunk on your final scene, but you can kind of imagine what that feels like. Again, the final scene would be the thing that you'd want to like think about how the thing comes to a conclusion. And then once you've got that beginning and end, right, you can start to fill in the details. I can imagine that you can all feel what that would feel like. And I just want to point out that like basically in under, not just under an hour, but under 30 minutes, right, you've built sort of like the entire narrative scaffold for like an experiential narrative kind of collage based world building experience. And right, once you have this prototype, you could like test it out and sort of see some initial explorations to see how audiences play with that. If you're in the Playable Theater Symposium, you obviously know that like feedback and beta testing is super important. But when I am speaking to game students, like I always underscore that because unlike theater, obviously you can't know if a game works until you get to have people play it. And the last thing I'll just say is like, though we've mostly focused on an analog space today, you could obviously take all of these same techniques and apply it to a digital process. The main thing that would be different is that you'd obviously be building the physical environment that the player explores at the same time as you're narrativizing it. So I'll leave some space for questions. But before I do that, I'll just mention like Swim Pony is on Facebook. We're also on Instagram. That's our website. If you want to get in touch with me, that is my email address, just adrienne@swimpony.org. We've got like 6 or 7 minutes left here before we have to wrap up. So I will stop the screen share and just see if anybody had any questions or thoughts that they wanted to offer up.
I have a question or maybe a discussion topic. My experience in collaborating with theater people has been that they see the space as a backdrop for actors. And when I have tried to do exactly what you did with us today and I like to think of the space as a character, that hasn't gone over that well with theater people. How can I convince them that the space has a role to play in telling the story beyond just a backdrop for the actors?
Boy, it's a really good question. I think you have to find the right theater people because I think there are some theater people you just may not be able to convince. And I think partly it's the fact that like most scripted theater begins from words on a page, right? Like it begins from language and it begins from characters talking to each other. And so like inherent in the way that the dominant form of theater is practiced right now, like space is a backdrop, right? Like the story isn't primarily being told through physical interaction. It's part of the reason that I bring designers into processes like from jump. And so I think a lot of it really depends on getting people. I would say like if you started collaborating with theater designers, you might have a different experience. And be careful about actors who are really invested in their performance. They're great to bring in eventually, but I think especially at those early stages, right? They're thinking about like the thing that they're going to say, not necessarily what the audience is going to do. I know that that's a helpful answer, but it's the one that I think is true. Yeah, Garland.
I'm curious, kind of going in the other direction, what are your thoughts on sort of bringing in the ideas of like game mechanics and interaction to theater people who might not have thought about storytelling in that way before, especially with like nonlinear storytellers like we work with in games?
Yeah. Do you mean just sort of like exposing them to that or like getting them
Yeah,
involved?
because
Yeah.
in a lot of my work, like at the university where I study, I'm one of very few people in the games theater intersection space. So it's something of a challenge to get people with more of a traditional theater background to understand enough of like games thinking to make these kinds of things all work.
The way that I often talk about it is the idea of inviting the audience into the rehearsal space because I think that's
Hmm.
a place that people like understand. Like, oh, you get to test things out, you get to try them. It's experiential, right? Like
Hmm.
you try a scene, you talk about it, you do it again. And so I often think like when I'm first getting theater people into the game interaction
Yeah.
space is I frame it from that. I say, well, what if the audience got to do the thing that you and
Hmm.
I get to do all the time?
Right. Hmm.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I know we're coming up on time here. Um, just checking out the chat here. Well, um, I think I want to hand the space over to our next speaker. But again, if you want to snag further conversation with me, I'm happy to share the slides for this PowerPoint if folks want. Just hit me up at swimpony.org. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram. I would love to be talking with more people because I love games and theater. So thanks so much for Playable Symposium and Indiecade for having me. See you
Thank you,
guys.
Adrienne.